The Last Boots on Syrian Soil, 2026. For more than a decade, American soldiers operated across the harsh landscapes of northeastern Syria. They patrolled endless deserts, crossed roads scarred by war, and worked alongside local partners in a mission that began with a clear objective: destroy ISIS and prevent its return. When American forces first entered Syria in 2014, ISIS controlled vast areas of territory stretching across Syria and Iraq. Entire cities had fallen under the group's rule. Millions lived in fear as ISIS attempted to build a self-declared caliphate through violence, terror, and intimidation. The organization executed civilians, enslaved minorities, and launched attacks that shocked the world. The United States joined an international coalition determined to eliminate that threat. Working closely with Kurdish fighters and other local forces who would later become known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, American troops helped dismantle ISIS's territorial control, one battle at a time. Years of fighting followed. Cities were liberated. ISIS strongholds collapsed. Its leaders were hunted down. Its fighters were scattered across deserts and remote villages. By the end of the campaign, the caliphate that once controlled millions of people had effectively ceased to exist. Yet the mission remained unfinished. ISIS had lost its territory, but it had not disappeared. Sleeper cells remained active throughout Syria's vast desert regions. Small groups of militants continued conducting attacks, recruiting followers, and searching for opportunities to rebuild their organization. American military commanders understood that defeating an insurgency required more than winning battles. Preventing a terrorist movement from returning was often harder than destroying it in the first place. That reality kept U.S. forces in Syria long after many observers expected them to leave. Then everything changed. In December 2024, one of the most significant events in Syria's modern history unfolded. The government of Bashar al-Assad collapsed after a rapid offensive led by opposition forces swept across the country. For years, Assad's government had survived against overwhelming odds. It endured civil war, international sanctions, foreign intervention, and repeated predictions of its downfall. Many believed his rule would continue indefinitely. Instead, the political landscape changed almost overnight. Major cities fell. Government positions collapsed. Military units surrendered or withdrew. Within days, the balance of power that had defined Syria for years disappeared. The world watched in surprise as Damascus changed hands. For Syrians, it marked the end of an era. For American military planners, it created an entirely new strategic reality. Thousands of U.S. troops remained deployed in northeastern Syria, operating in a country whose political future had suddenly become uncertain. New questions emerged immediately. Who would govern Syria? Could extremist groups exploit the chaos? Would ISIS attempt to rebuild itself amid the instability? And what role would the United States play moving forward? At that time, approximately 2,000 American troops remained inside Syria. The Pentagon later confirmed that number publicly, revealing that the force was larger than many people had previously understood. Additional personnel had been deployed during the final months of 2024 as conditions on the ground became increasingly unpredictable. Despite the dramatic political changes, the military mission remained unchanged. Defeat ISIS, support partner forces, maintain regional stability. However, discussions about the future were already taking place in Washington. Military leaders and policymakers began evaluating how long such a large American presence would remain necessary. The collapse of Assad's government fundamentally altered the strategic calculations that had guided U.S. policy for years. By early 2025, plans for a major transition were taking shape. On April 17, 2025, the Department of Defense announced a significant change in strategy. American forces would begin consolidating their presence across Syria. Rather than maintaining multiple bases spread throughout the country, troops would gradually concentrate in fewer locations. The objective was straightforward: reduce the military footprint, maintain operational effectiveness, prepare for future transitions. Officials confirmed that the total number of American personnel would eventually be reduced to fewer than 1,000 troops. For soldiers serving on the ground, the announcement represented a major turning point. Some bases would close, others would be downsized. Equipment would be transferred. Responsibilities would increasingly shift to local partners. The process did not happen overnight. It involved months of planning, logistics, and coordination between military units operating across Syria. Convoys moved equipment between bases. Sensitive systems were removed or transferred. Facilities were prepared for eventual handover. American forces began withdrawing from positions in Deir ez-Zor Governorate, an area that had played a critical role during the fight against ISIS. Many troops viewed the departure with mixed emotions. Some had spent years operating from those locations. Others had fought major battles nearby. Every base carried memories of missions, hardships, and sacrifices. Yet military service requires adaptation. Missions evolve. Priorities change. Orders are followed. As withdrawals continued, the focus increasingly shifted toward Hasaka Governorate in northeastern Syria. The region became the center of remaining American operations. Despite the drawdown, counterterrorism activities never stopped. This was an important reality often overlooked by outside observers. Reducing troop numbers did not mean ending the fight against ISIS. American forces continued conducting intelligence operations. Surveillance aircraft monitored extremist activity. Special operations teams remained prepared to launch raids. Military planners continued tracking ISIS networks throughout the region. The threat still existed, and commanders remained determined to prevent any resurgence. At the same time, diplomatic developments were reshaping the broader strategy. Officials in Washington increasingly viewed Syria through a different lens. Some believed future influence would depend less on military bases and more on diplomacy, economic cooperation, and partnerships with emerging political leaders. The battlefield was changing. The war itself was entering a new phase. By May 2025, approximately 500 American troops had already departed Syria. The final U.S. base in Deir ez-Zor was vacated, marking the end of a significant chapter in the American military presence there. Military officials indicated that 7 of the country's 8 American bases would eventually be closed. The drawdown was accelerating. Still, combat operations continued. On June 17, 2025, 2 American bases in Hasaka were officially transferred to the Syrian Democratic Forces. The handover reflected growing confidence in local partners who had fought alongside American troops for years. Together, they had faced ISIS during its most powerful period. Together, they had endured difficult battles and heavy losses. Now, those same partners were assuming greater responsibility for regional security. Then, in July, American forces demonstrated that they remained fully capable of conducting offensive operations despite the ongoing withdrawal. On July 25, 2025, U.S. troops carried out a ground raid in Aleppo Governorate, targeting senior ISIS leadership. The operation successfully eliminated Deir Zar, Bar Muslih al-Hardani, a senior ISIS leader, along with his 2 adult sons, both active members of the organization. The raid sent a clear message. The United States might be reducing its military presence, but it was not abandoning the fight against terrorism. ISIS leaders remained targets. American forces remained dangerous, and the mission continued. Throughout the summer of 2025, soldiers packed equipment, dismantled facilities, and prepared for an uncertain future. Some wondered if they were witnessing the final chapter of America's long military presence in Syria. Others focused only on the next mission, the next patrol, the next briefing, the next day. What everyone understood was that Syria was changing faster than it had in years. The Assad era was over. American forces were shrinking their footprint. Local partners were taking greater responsibility. and the future of Syria was beginning to take shape in ways few could have predicted only months earlier. As the summer of 2025 gave way to autumn, the situation in Syria continued to evolve in ways that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. For more than a decade, the relationship between Washington and Damascus had been defined by hostility, sanctions, military operations, and deep mistrust. American forces had operated inside Syria without coordination with the Assad government, focusing primarily on defeating ISIS and supporting local partner forces. Now, a completely different political landscape was emerging. The collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government in December 2024 had opened the door to new possibilities. Syria's new leadership faced enormous challenges. The country remained devastated by years of war. Infrastructure was damaged. Millions of people had been displaced. Entire regions required reconstruction. At the same time, the new government sought international recognition and support. In Washington, policymakers were beginning to reconsider America's role in Syria. Many officials believed that long-term stability would depend less on military deployments and more on diplomatic engagement. The battlefield was no longer the only arena where the future of Syria would be decided. Political negotiations were becoming just as important. As American troop levels continued to decline throughout 2025, discussions between Washington and Damascus expanded. Both sides recognized that defeating ISIS permanently required cooperation, even if they had once been adversaries. This new reality created one of the most remarkable political transformations of the post-Assad era. Individuals and organizations that had once stood on opposite sides of the conflict were now searching for areas of common interest. The primary concern remained ISIS. Although weakened, the terrorist organization still maintained sleeper cells throughout Syria. Its fighters continued conducting attacks in remote areas and attempting to exploit security gaps created by political change. No government wanted to see ISIS return. No military commander wanted to repeat the battles of the previous decade. As a result, cooperation gradually increased. For American troops still serving in Syria, these political developments often felt distant from daily life. Their focus remained on security operations, intelligence gathering, and supporting local partners. Yet they could sense that the mission was changing. Every month brought additional withdrawals. Every month brought new diplomatic announcements. The direction of travel was becoming increasingly clear. The American military presence was approaching its final phase. One of the most symbolic moments occurred in November 2025. For the first time since Syria gained independence in 1946, a Syrian president visited Washington. The visit captured international attention. Only a short time earlier, such an event would have been unimaginable. The meeting represented a dramatic shift in regional politics and reflected the changing relationship between the United States and Syria's new leadership. During the visit, Syria announced its entry into the international coalition against ISIS, joining dozens of countries committed to combating the terrorist organization. The significance of this decision was enormous. For years, Syria had been one of the primary battlegrounds in the war against ISIS. Now its government was formally joining the same coalition that had conducted operations inside its territory. The strategic logic behind maintaining a large American military presence was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. If Syria itself was joining the anti-ISIS coalition, many policymakers argued that local institutions should eventually assume responsibility for security. The mission that began with American boots on the ground was gradually transitioning to Syrian hands. Then, just as optimism about the future began to grow, tragedy struck. In December 2025, a shocking incident sent waves through military installations, government offices, and diplomatic circles alike. 2 American soldiers and 1 interpreter were killed during an attack carried out by a member of Syria's internal security forces. The attacker was immediately killed by US personnel at the scene, but the damage had already been done. The deaths represented the deadliest incident involving American troops in Syria since the fall of Assad. News of the attack spread rapidly. Families back home received devastating notifications. Commanders reviewed security procedures. Political leaders demanded answers. The incident threatened to undermine months of efforts aimed at building trust between Washington and Damascus. Questions emerged immediately. Was the attack connected to ISIS? Was it an isolated act? Could future cooperation survive such a tragedy? The pressure on American leaders was immense. Many observers expected an immediate withdrawal. Others demanded a powerful military response. PR. President Donald Trump publicly blamed ISIS and promised retaliation. The response came quickly. During the night of December 19th and December 20th, coalition aircraft launched one of the largest operations conducted in Syria since the collapse of the caliphate. F-15 fighter jets roared across the night sky. A-10 attack aircraft targeted militant positions. Apache helicopters engaged enemy targets. HIMARS rocket systems delivered precision strikes. Jordanian F-16s joined the operation. By the time the attacks concluded, approximately 70 ISIS-related targets had been struck. The objective was simple: destroy terrorist infrastructure, eliminate active fighters, demonstrate that the coalition remained committed to defeating ISIS. The operation sent a powerful message throughout the region. The United States might have been reducing its military footprint, but it remained fully capable of projecting force. The following days saw additional activity. Coalition forces conducted multiple ground missions targeting ISIS networks. Several militants were killed. Others were captured. Intelligence operations intensified. Pressure on the organization increased. The message was unmistakable. ISIS would not be allowed to exploit the transition period. Even as troops prepared to leave Syria, the counterterrorism mission remained active. Military leaders understood that withdrawals often create opportunities for extremist groups. History had demonstrated that terrorist organizations frequently attempt to regroup during periods of political uncertainty. Preventing that outcome became a top priority. The events of December also served as a test of the emerging relationship between Washington and Damascus. Despite the attack, both governments continued pursuing cooperation. Neither side wanted a single incident to derail broader strategic objectives. That decision required patience and discipline. For American service members still stationed in Syria, the situation highlighted the complexity of their mission. One day involved coordinating with local partners. The next involved responding to deadly violence. One day focused on preparing equipment for transfer. The next involved conducting combat operations. The contradiction reflected the reality of modern military withdrawals. Wars rarely end with a clear finish line. Instead, they fade gradually from conflict into transition. As 2025 came to a close, the future remained uncertain. American troop numbers continued to decline. Political relationships continued to evolve. ISIS remained weakened, but dangerous. The mission was approaching its conclusion, but the final chapter had not yet been written. The coming months would determine how America's long military presence in Syria would ultimately end. Would the transition succeed? Would local forces maintain stability? Would ISIS remain defeated? Those questions would soon face their ultimate test. As 2026 began, the American mission in Syria entered its final stage. For years, discussions about a possible withdrawal had surfaced again and again. Presidents debated it. Military commanders planned for it. Analysts predicted it. Yet the mission continued, adapting to new threats and changing circumstances. This time was different. The drawdown was no longer a possibility. It was happening. Despite ongoing preparations for departure, the fight against ISIS had not ended. American commanders remained determined to ensure that extremist groups could not exploit the transition. On January 10th, 2026, US and Jordanian forces launched another major operation against ISIS targets near Deir ez-Zor. The scale of the attack demonstrated that American military power remained fully capable of reaching deep into Syrian territory. F-15E Strike Eagles participated in the operation. A-10 attack aircraft joined the mission. AC-130 gunships provided devastating firepower. MQ-9 Reaper drones monitored targets and gathered intelligence. Jordanian Fes. 16 fighters flew alongside coalition aircraft. More than 90 precision-guided munitions struck ISIS positions during a single night. The attack destroyed militant infrastructure, disrupted terrorist networks, and reinforced a critical message. The United States might be leaving Syria, but it would not leave behind an opportunity for ISIS to rebuild. For the soldiers stationed at the remaining bases, the contrast was striking. One day they were conducting combat operations. The next day they were packing equipment for shipment. One moment they were planning missions. The next they were preparing facilities for closure. The end of a military deployment is rarely dramatic. Most of the work happens through logistics. Inventories must be completed. Vehicles must be transported. Sensitive equipment must be removed. Weapons systems must be accounted for. Communications networks must be dismantled. Every piece of equipment represents months or years of planning and investment. Nothing can simply be abandoned. In February 2026, President Donald Trump officially ordered the complete withdrawal of American forces from Syria within the following months. The decision reflected both military realities and political priorities. The original objective of destroying ISIS's territorial caliphate had been achieved years earlier. Syria's new government had joined the international coalition against ISIS. Local forces had gained extensive combat experience, and public support for maintaining a long-term deployment continued to decline. For many military leaders, the focus shifted from fighting a war to managing a successful transition. One of the most visible signs of the withdrawal occurred at Kasrak Air Base in Hasaka province. For years, the installation had served as an important hub for American operations in northeastern Syria. Now, convoys of trucks began carrying equipment to ward northern Iraq. Heavy machinery rolled out through the gates. Armored vehicles were loaded onto transport platforms. Containers filled with supplies moved across long desert roads. The process was slow and methodical. Every movement had to be coordinated. Every convoy required protection. Even during withdrawal, security remained a constant concern. ISIS still existed. Threats still existed. The mission was not officially over. Around the same time, another historic milestone occurred. American forces completed their departure from Al-Tanf. Located near the borders of Syria, Iraq, and Jordan, Al-Tanf had long been considered one of the most strategically important American positions in the region. For years, the base served as a key location for monitoring militant activity and disrupting regional smuggling networks. Military planners had once viewed it as indispensable. Now, its mission was complete. The departure from Al-Tanf symbolized just how dramatically the situation in Syria had changed. One by one, the bases that had defined America's military presence were shutting down. But before the final withdrawal could be completed, one major issue remained. Thousands of captured ISIS fighters were still being held in detention facilities across northeastern Syria. Leaving those prisoners behind was not an option. Many had participated in some of the most brutal acts committed during the rise of the caliphate. Their future needed to be resolved before American forces departed. In a massive logistical operation, approximately 5,700 ISIS detainees were transferred from Syrian detention centers to Iraq. The transfer required extensive coordination between governments, military organizations, and security agencies. Each prisoner had to be identified, processed, and transported safely. The operation represented one of the most important but least visible aspects of the withdrawal. Without it, the risk of future instability would have been significantly higher. By early spring, only a small number of American troops remained in Syria. Most of the major installations had already been handed over or vacated. The mission that began more than a decade earlier was nearing its conclusion. Then came April 16, 2026. The date would become the final chapter in America's military presence in Syria. At Kasrak Air Base, the last convoy prepared to leave. Military vehicles stood ready. Equipment had been loaded. Personnel completed final inspections. Years of history were coming to an end. For some soldiers, it was simply another mission. For others, it was deeply emotional. Many had spent multiple deployments in Syria. Some had lost friends there. Others had built strong relationships with local partners who had fought beside them against ISIS. As engines started and vehicles moved toward the gates, a chapter of military history closed. The final convoy departed Kasrak and headed toward the border. The withdrawal was complete. Shortly afterward, Syrian government forces entered the facility and assumed control. American flags were lowered. Syrian flags were raised. Bases that had once housed U.S. troops now belonged to Syria once again. Officials from both governments confirmed the transition. American military leaders described the withdrawal as deliberate and conditions-based. The emphasis mattered. This was not presented as a retreat. It was presented as a planned transfer of responsibility. The mission had evolved. The role of American troops had changed, and the time had come for local institutions to carry the burden of security. The significance of the moment extended far beyond military strategy. For American veterans who had served in Syria, it marked the end of a conflict that shaped a generation of service members. Thousands of soldiers had rotated through the country since 2014. They endured extreme heat, harsh winters, long deployments, and constant uncertainty. Many participated in the battles that destroyed ISIS' territorial caliphate. Others trained partner forces, provided medical support, gathered intelligence, or maintained critical supply networks. Each played a role in a mission larger than themselves. For the Syrian Democratic Forces, the withdrawal represented a new responsibility. For years they had fought alongside American troops. Now they would carry much of the burden themselves. Their future would increasingly depend on cooperation with Syria's national government and regional partners. For Syria itself, the departure marked another step toward rebuilding a country devastated by more than a decade of war. The challenges remained enormous. Cities still required reconstruction. Millions of displaced people still hoped to return home. Political divisions remained unresolved. Economic hardship continued. Yet the country was entering a new chapter. The war that had defined Syrian life for so long was finally beginning to fade into history. No simple verdict exists for America's mission in Syria. Some view it as a success because ISIS lost its caliphate and its territorial control was destroyed. Others point to the immense costs of prolonged conflict and the many challenges that remain unresolved. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is that the mission changed the course of history. ISIS lost its territory. A dictator lost power. Regional alliances shifted, and after more than 11 years, American soldiers finally went home. The last convoy disappeared into the distance beneath a Syrian spring sky. The desert remained. The roads remained. The memories remained. But the boots that once patrolled those roads were gone. For more than a decade, American forces had been part of Syria's story. Now, that story belonged to the Syrians. The future of the country would be written not by foreign soldiers, but by the people who called Syria home. And with that, one of the longest chapters in America's post-9/11 military history came to an end.